That completes the wafer tumbler locks. Now let's take a look at how to impression pin tumbler locks. This diagram shows a cross-section through a typical pin tumbler lock. We're only looking at one tumbler in this example. This is the outer housing of the lock. This is the pin chamber, which contains the spring, the top pin, which is sometimes called the driver, and the bottom pin. The key is inserted into the keyway here, and this is the core of the lock, which rotates when the correct key is inserted. This point where the top pin and the bottom pin meet is known as the shear line. This is where the two pins separate when the correct key is inserted into the lock. When there is no key in the lock, the core cannot turn because the top pin is extending between the outer housing of the lock and the lock core. The top pin and the bottom pin together are known as the pin stack. If the pin stack is raised too high, then the bottom pin will extend between the core of the lock and the lock housing, preventing the core from turning. The lock core can only rotate when a pin stack has been raised so that the shear line between the two pins is flush with the top edge of the lock core. The bottom pin is held captive inside the lock core as it rotates. When we impression a pin tumbler cylinder, we use the same three steps that we used on a wafer tumbler cylinder. We twist to bind the lock, bump the key to make the mark, and then release. When we twist, we are binding the bottom pin between the lock core and the lock housing. Bumping the key against the pin while it is bound makes our mark. But just as with the wafer tumbler lock, the pin moves slightly when we bump it. Bumping it a second time will not give you a mark. You must release the cylinder between bumps. The tolerances in our drawing have been somewhat exaggerated to better show you the different movements of the pin. Just as in our earlier diagram, the red color is used to indicate where the binding forces are taking place. Notice that the bottom of the bottom pin is pointed where it presses against the key blade. This means that instead of a rectangular mark as we had on our wafer tumbler locks, we will very often have round marks square in the center of the key blade. However, if the key blade is offset to one side, such as in a Ford, then our round marks will appear on either one side or the other of the key blade. Just as with the wafer tumbler lock, the marks will stop when your key is filed to the correct depth. This is because there is no longer a binding force on the pin when the pin is at the shear line. However, just as with the wafer tumbler lock, if you file too deeply, the marks will resume. This is because the top pin is then binding between the housing and the core, giving you marks once again for the same reason that the bottom pin gave you marks, because of the binding force. You must file your key slowly. If you take off too much metal, you will pass the shear point and you will never know it. Let's look at some typical pin tumbler marks. There are 4 marks on this key actually. The 2 strongest marks are highlighted with the arrows. These are typical pin tumbler marks. We're just starting out on this particular key. They are round, shiny spots in the center of the key blade. Here's the same key a little further along in the impressioning process. These are really good marks. These are round dents in the center of the key blade. They're actual depressions in the blade of the key. With most pin tumbler locks, I prefer a straightforward twist and bump method of bumping. Twist to one side and bump. Twist to the other side and bump. Always bumping in the direction of the pin stack. The figure-8 method of key bumping is also effective on pin tumbler locks, but not as effective as it is on a wafer tumbler lock. If I'm having trouble getting marks on a key, I will alternate between the twist and bump and the figure-8 method of bumping. Just as with the wafer tumbler locks, simply putting the key in the lock and wiggling it from side to side is no way to impression. You might get a mark or two this way, but nothing like you will get when you twist and bump.